Now, one of the things that makes debugging LINQ queries a little bit difficult is deferred execution. Now, why is that a problem? Well, suppose we had this LINQ query where we're taking some numbers, squaring them, halving them, and then subtracting 5. And let's imagine we're not seeing the results we were expecting, and so we want to debug this to work out what's going wrong. Now, if we were using Visual Studio to debug this pipeline and we wanted to add a breakpoint, we can try that by clicking in the margin as you would normally, but you'll see that the whole LINQ query gets set as a breakpoint. And so if I run this program, then it will break at this breakpoint, but when I step over to the next line, of course, none of my lambda expressions have actually run yet, and that's because of deferred execution. None of this code is going to run until we loop through our loop. And when we do loop through this for each loop, we only get to see the values coming out the end of our pipeline. But of course, this doesn't show us what the intermediate values are at each stage in the pipeline, which will be really useful for debugging. Now, one way that some developers will try to solve this is to take their LINQ pipeline and break it up into lots of individual statements and putting a toList on the end of each one. And of course, now that means that we could step through the debugger and we could look at the values at each stage as a list. But of course, now it's not really a pipeline anymore. We've introduced quite a bit of inefficiency just to make things easier to debug. So this isn't really the best approach if you want visibility into what's happening in your LINQ pipelines. And so you might end up thinking, LINQ is actually making it really hard for me to debug. If only I'd written just a for each loop like this, then I could put a breakpoint on each step in the calculation and step through watching the transformation happen to each element in the sequence one by one. Now, is it possible for us to get this same nice debugging experience with LINQ? Well, actually, Visual Studio does let you put breakpoints on each individual lambda expression. Here we are back at our original pipeline, and let's see how we can do this. What you need to do is put the mouse cursor somewhere in the body of the lambda expression, and then you can either right-click and select Insert Breakpoint like this, and you can also add them using a keyboard shortcut, which by default is F9. And you can see from the syntax highlighting that these breakpoints only apply to the individual lambda expressions. And so now we can step through and we can see each stage of our pipeline getting evaluated one by one. And you can also see the order things are happening in. We execute each of these lambdas and then we execute the code inside our for each loop, and then we go back and take the next element all the way through the pipeline. So this actually will also give you good insight into what order your lambda expressions run in when you're executing a LINQ query. So that's how you can debug a LINQ pipeline in Visual Studio step by step. But what about when you're not in Visual Studio? What about if your LINQ pipeline is running in production and you want to diagnose a problem by writing out what's happening to a log file? Let's look next at how we can do that.